In 1955, a nearly suicidal 65-year-old Colonel Sanders moved to Shelbyville, Kentucky, hoping to succeed. After numerous failed attempts to build a successful chicken restaurant, he was left with no other option but to approach restaurants pleading to sell his secret recipe for 4 cents in profits. But instead, he was turned down 1,009 times. As luck fell on his side on his next attempt, Colonel Sanders would create the world's largest fast food fried chicken franchise and the tastiest chicken recipe the world has ever tasted. This is the story of how a retired colonel became the icon of the fried chicken industry. Colonel Harland Sanders was born on a small farm in Henryville, Indiana, to Wilbur David and Margaret Ann on the 9th of September, 1890. His parents were farmers who owned a large acre of farmland but could barely make enough money to care for their children. As though life couldn't get any harder, Wilbur broke his leg in a fall, causing him to stop his farming activities, and to sustain the family, he decided to become a butcher. Unfortunately, Wilbur developed a fever and could barely work anymore. It was later discovered that his fever wasn't just any normal fever, but deadly hay fever. In 1895, Wilbur died, causing Sanders to assume the responsibility of a caregiver in the family at such an early age of 5. After the death of Wilbur, Sanders' mother, Margaret, was left penniless and in abject poverty, and to take care of her 3 children, she went far and near looking for a job. As luck would have it, she got a job at a local tomato canning factory and sometimes worked as a seamstress for nearby families, but she was mostly away from home due to the nature of her job. Sanders, the eldest child of his parents, was forced to take care of his 2 younger siblings. And to help her pursuit, his mother taught him how to cook at age 7. Sanders was a natural with bread and vegetables as he was responsible for cooking for his siblings when his mother was away at her local tomato canning factory or seamstress job. Sanders decided to look for a job to assist his mother, and at age 10, he got his first job as a farmhand at a local farm in 1900. Margaret decided remarrying was the best idea for the family as she could no longer bear the burden of caring for the children alone. In 1902, Margaret remarried, causing them to move to her new husband's home in the suburbs outside of Indianapolis. Unfortunately, her new husband wasn't keen on having stepchildren. Hence, he wasn't kind to Sanders or his siblings, causing a strained relationship between him and Sanders. Eventually, Sanders left home for Clark County, where the family first lived, to escape from his stepfather and search for greener pastures. However, his journey for greener pastures would turn out to be a long, thriving one filled with many uncertainties. In 1902, Sanders worked at a farm in Greenwood, Indiana, after he had left home. He was paid a monthly salary of $10 to $15 and offered a room to stay in. Sanders had to shuffle between work and school as he needed to feed the animals early in the morning before going to school. And after completing the 6th grade, Sanders dropped out of school at 16. Sanders, however, claimed in his autobiography that it was due to the difficulty of algebra that he dropped out. He said, "Algebra's what drove me off." After quitting school in 1906, Sanders asked his mother for permission to live with his uncle in New Albany, Indiana, to which she agreed. At the time, his uncle worked at a streetcar company and aided in securing a conductor job for Sanders. Sanders worked as a streetcar conductor for some months before he decided to join the U.S. Army. However, he was too young for the age requirement, so he falsified his age and enlisted in the Army. He was positioned in Cuba, where he served for some months until he was honorably discharged after completing the mission in February 1907. After his discharge, he would go on to experience several career paths in search of success. Sanders moved to Sheffield, Alabama to live with an uncle who worked for the Southern Railroad. His uncle secured him a job at his company as a blacksmith's helper in the workshops. Sanders worked this job for 2 months effortlessly, but the pay wasn't good enough, so he moved to Jasper, Alabama to work as a train ash pan cleaner for the Northern Alabama Railroad. He would also go on to work as a steam engine fireman, where he stoked the fire and managed the steam for almost 3 years. However, he was fired for insubordination after falling ill. In 1908, Sanders started working as a laborer with the Norfolk and Western Railway. During this period, he met Josephine King in Jasper, Alabama. Josephine was a home girl whose father was a merchant in town. She was Daddy's precious little girl, who was neither attending school nor teaching, nor did she have any cooking knowledge. Her first cooking lessons came from Sanders, who criticized everything she did in the kitchen. Sanders said, her family had always hired cooks. She used to say she'd never marry another man who knew how to cook. She meant I criticized everything she did. Sanders fell in love with Josephine and they married shortly afterward. Sanders and Josephine would go on to have 3 children. After his wedding to Josephine, Sanders left his job and worked as a fireman on the Illinois Central Railroad after moving to Jackson, Tennessee with his wife. While working as a fireman in the daytime, Sanders studied law at the LaSalle Extension University at night. Unfortunately, Sanders lost his job as a fireman after fighting with a colleague. His wife, Josephine, wasn't happy about his inability to keep a job as they could barely take care of the children, so she left with the kids and went back to her parents' house. After some years, Sanders began practicing law in Little Rock. He had hoped being a lawyer would be his pathway to success. Sanders was good at the profession and, surprisingly, had kept his job for 3 years. At the time, the law profession could have been his pathway to success as he had gained a good reputation and made enough money to bring his wife back home. Unluckily for him, he would once again experience failure in his pathway as he was involved in a courtroom brawl with his client, causing him to lose his job and tarnish his reputation. After the incident, Sanders had no choice but to leave Tennessee and move back to Henryville to live with his mother. Moving back to Henryville was a hit on Sanders, who thought he would have achieved a better life at that age. Unfortunately, his temper was not in agreement with his goals. However, Sanders would go on to start all over again, determined like never before to succeed. He decided to work as a laborer on the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1916, Sanders and his family moved to Jeffersonville, where Sanders took a job as an insurance salesman for the Prudential Life Insurance Company, in which he was fired for insubordination. He then moved to Louisville, where he got another insurance salesman job with Mutual Benefit Life of New Jersey. At a time when the ferry boats business was booming, and those who operated this industry became the wealthiest people in the city, Sanders then opened his ferry boat company in 1920, which operated on the Ohio River between Jeffersonville and Louisville. He, however, needed funding, so he sold the majority of the shares